Afternoon, thank you. This afternoon's or today's theme is very central to my role. I was once mistakenly sent an envelope from abroad addressed to Charlie Mawer, BBC Head of Creation, which was wrong on quite a few levels, partly because of course we all know that's actually David Attenborough's title. But actually anybody who is a creative director, which is my title, the generation of ideas, innovation, and particularly the development of people whose responsibility it is to have ideas is absolutely essential. And I'm just going to share with you a kind of top 10 tips for developing creative talent today. But let's start with how creatives say they like to be motivated. Richard Florida wrote a fantastic book called The Rise of the Creative Class, and in that he did a survey of some 20,000 people working in the creative industry, and he asked them to list their order of things that motivate them. And I'm going to draw you to the top three: challenge, responsibility, and flexibility, because those in effect have become my holy trinity for managing creative talent. Those are the things that people say they want most out of life in order to be creatively productive. So let's take them one by one and start with challenge. Now, my task is to get them to produce as many good ideas as possible. And for me, the best way of doing that is to get them to pitch in competition, the fulcrum of competition. Now, when lots of companies are tasked with generating lots of ideas, then traditionally they'll go for the brainstorm method. And academics are beginning to realise, and Jonah Lehrer wrote brilliantly in the New Yorker about this, that there's a fundamental problem with brainstorms, which is they don't work. Brainstorms tend to produce one very good idea that fundamentally everyone in the room builds around, because as human beings we're innately quite nice to each other. We don't really like conflict. So if you want to produce a volume of lateral quality ideas, that only comes from individuals or teams working in isolation of each other and in competition. A second way of introducing challenge to the creative process is to get people to redefine a mundane task. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge fan of the Liverpool poet Brian Patton, and in particular this poem of his, which I'll share the first 3 verses of, called A Blade of Grass. You ask for a poem, I offer you a blade of grass. You say it is not good enough, you ask for a poem. I say this blade of grass will do, it has dressed itself in frost, it is more immediate than any image of my making. You say it is not a poem, it is a blade of grass, and grass is not quite good enough. I offer you a blade of grass. Now, why that's important is, for me, it's a constant reminder in my life that actually any task is, even the most mundane thing is full of possibilities. So if you were tasked with, in this instance, designing the logo for Doctor Who, you could sit down at your desk and think, right, well, I've got to produce something that's going to work across a range of merchandise in retail outlets and pull it together with a coherent marketing identity. Or you could say, take the same task, reframe it and think, I'm going to produce a template for every schoolboy in this country and schoolgirl to sketch a Doctor Who logo on their notebooks. And it's by that simple reframing that great ideas emerge. Third point I want to make is, if you're managing creative talent, it's important to give them space to do their own personal work. And I actively take as much pride in the work that my teams do for themselves than they do for me. So, for example, I've let a creative director go off and spend quite a large part of the last 7 years working on a documentary about Kenyan middle distance runners. Similarly, one of our senior designers is currently producing an extraordinary animated film about a true life crime that was solved by Arthur Conan Doyle, a miscarriage of justice, in fact. So why do I let them go and do it? Well, it's obviously partly because any experience that you have in life you will bring back to the idea generation for your paid employer, in this case me. But also, if you think back to challenge and responsibility, those things can only really happen on your own projects. True responsibility only happens when you're the ultimate client and creative director. It was said brilliantly by Dave Droger, who was one of my heroes creatively. He said, as much as we celebrate our work, we celebrate our people. I love to know that people in our office are not just one-dimensional advertising people. Creativity Is it best produced from an individual or from a team? The loneliness of the long-distance creative. Well, advertising agencies for the last 80, 90 years have always bequeathed the act of creativity to two people, an art director and a copywriter, slightly arcane titles, sitting opposite each other in a room. And I don't think that works for two reasons. One, because I think it's wrong to bequeath the act of creativity to anybody, it's open to all. And secondly, because two people sitting facing each other day after day after day is not the most flexible and dynamic of situations. I think it's much better for an idea to really blossom. Of course you need a team around it. Creativity is a lonely process. Even Ricky Gervais needs his Stephen Merchant to have the right people coming in at the right point of the process, whether that's collaborators in the production of it, whether it is a creative partner, whether it's just my role as a mentor. The important thing is a collaborative process with the right people at the right time. It's what Dan Wyden, another advertising icon, calls the baseball bullpen approach, when you pluck out the right player for the right moment of the game and you fuse them together to form a team. A little diversion at this point, just a word about training. One of the worst things I think for creative people is to just train them with the tools that they need to do their job. Creative people need constantly tipping off their axis. This visual is because I asked my wife, who also used to work in advertising, what was the best bit of training she ever had. And she didn't say, oh, that extraordinary week where we went away and looked at marketing theory of product development, or that day of idea generation workshops we went to, or the copywriting week. She said it was the time that she was taught how to climb the mast of a tall ship in a 90-foot tall ship in a force 10 gale. Why? Because that was when she was taught about courage and responsibility and her own limits. And you need to keep training as flexible and different to stimulate creatives. And there's also a moment in any creative manager's life when they have to take the hand of someone and jump off the abyss into a world where they are going to have to do something that they've never done before and that you've got no certainty that they'll be able to do it themselves. I'll give you an example of this. A few years ago, we wrote an advert for the BBC to promote their coverage of football. And it was quite a brave piece that drew a very direct analogy between the ability of football commentators and their immediate verbal dexterity on the hoof, and that of rappers, drawing on Eminem's recent film at the time, 8 Mile. And now in the face of sort of fairly furious resistance from clients at the time, I entrusted this to a very, very young, inexperienced director, not because I could say he's done this before, and I'm certain he can do it, but because I was certain that if he did do it, it would be the making of him. So I'll show you the film and then tell you what happened. The director was a guy called Ron Scalpello, and last autumn I was hugely proud that his first feature film based on the London riots called Offender came out, and it's a really great piece and he's in development on his second feature film. And what I'm particularly happy about is that he's moved on, because that's important for creative people as well. You have to accept that they will grow and move on, and frequently move on away from you. because keeping on moving is really important to creatives. Before Richard Florida's survey told me this, I could have told you that the single greatest enemy to creativity is boredom. Creative people need to be constantly stimulated. Now, in my office, we, like many firms, actually through financial necessity, we've moved into a hot desking environment, but it was the single best thing that could have happened, because my creatives now sit next to different people every day and they have different conversations. They could be sitting next to a digital strategist one minute or a print producer the next. But more importantly, they're actually just looking at a different bit of the wall, or they're looking out of a different window. And so I think this is applicable, even if you're a writer at home on your own in the study. Move the furniture around. Find a way of stimulating yourself. We throw things like photography competitions or even baking challenges on a daily basis to creatives, just to, again, tip them off the axis, keep them thinking, keep them stimulated, stop them getting bored. Which leads to one of the reasons behind point 8. Charity projects or not-for-profit projects are not just for the charity themselves. This is an image from the winning entry in Saatchi & Saatchi's global internal competition, and it's a blood bank that they developed, a joint blood bank between Israelis and Palestinians. It's quite an extraordinary project that also went to win the D&AD white pencil. Now, D&AD last year set up the white pencil, and they encouraged the advertising community to get behind probably one of the single greatest ideas, period, of the last few years, Jeremy Gillies' Peace One Day initiative, which is set up to try and establish September the 21st as a global day of peace. And the reason advertising agencies take part in things like this is not just because it's an amazing event that genuinely saves lives every year, but it's also because you know that it's another opportunity to put together a different team of people with flexibility and challenge and stimulus that you wouldn't necessarily get on your paid daily client projects. In our case, it enabled us to create a website called Peace Baby, which puts together babies from around the world who are born on September the 21st in a global social network, because our theory was that children born without the sound of gunfire in their ears will probably be quite special. Penultimately, and this is not a dig at the great tutors of design and advertising colleges, but I think it's really important in recruiting terms to look beyond people who are trained in the process of idea generation, because that produces only one type of idea. There's a little bit of bias in this, I suspect, because I actually emerged from Oxford University with a degree in English and the ability to translate Beowulf from the original Anglo-Saxon, and no proven ability to generate ideas. The Doctor Who logo I showed you earlier was not designed by a designer with a designer's background. It was designed by the former keyboard player in a Manchester baggy group. We even hired once a bovine veterinary expert. Frankly, didn't work out, but the point still holds true, which is out of the chaos of not knowing how to generate ideas without formal academic training in that, sometimes the most surprising and remarkable ideas emerge. Finally, and there's a sort of deliberate oxymoron here, original ideas and where they come from. The ultimate quest for originality. It's a source of constant debate in the advertising and design communities, partly because we're all part magpies, part impersonators, partly because originality somehow seems to become harder in the howl around of the social network now, where every idea is instantly shared on a global basis. It's not surprising that frequently, in movies as well, that the same idea appears to land in multiple places at the same point. Because every idea is, of course, drawn from every experience that you've had from birth to the point that you put pen to paper. So how do you define originality when everything is always a result of those? Well, I'll give you one example to close. When we created a circle as the emblem for BBC One, as a means of showing how it draws the nation together, that wasn't an original idea. It wasn't an original idea because it deliberately drew on a heritage going all the way back to 1953, and Ephraim Games' first ever moving visual identity for a television station in the world, the Batwings logo, again with the same circle. So you then have to think, well, okay, well, where are we going to introduce originality to this thought if that's not original? And this kind of, in essence, shows that challenge, because two ways that we did it. One piece of identity work was deliberately drawn and totally inspired by a photograph I'd seen from a French photographer, a wonderful French photographer called Al Magnus. Very important, if you are inspired by something, credit your sources. So there, the creativity and the challenge was about taking that and telling a story around it and making it into a moving visual design parable for the act of collaboration. But I can trace to the single photograph where the inspiration came from. Now, by contrast, I have absolutely no idea where the idea of hippos swimming together in a synchronized swimming formation came from. Now, it might be that I've seen Fantasia at some point in my childhood, though I actually don't think I have. It might have been something to do with my children's bath toys, which I know were purple hippos at the time. But I think, and during the whole, because it's quite a lengthy production process, I was terrified that at the point this went on air, someone somewhere else would have been working on a synchronized swimming hippo idea, because I would have somehow seen the same influences and the same inspirations as them. But few, they didn't. And I think that's because ultimately an original idea, and the ambition for all of the people that I train and mentor, is when you can't actually trace the inspiration, when you've been exposed to so many fantastic stimuluses over the course of your life and your career that you can't even trace the moment of inspiration. Thank you very much.